Happy New Year! It's January 1st. Which means I must decide on the best books I read this past year, a process I actually greatly enjoy and am often surprised by, particularly this year, because I usually consider the best books I read in a year to be near perfect, minimal criticism. I wouldn't change much about them, but that isn't necessarily true for these books. Instead, I've found that as I read more across genres and periods and forms, what I value above all else is complete and utter commitment. And maybe it's a part of getting older or being a chronic overthinker, but to be zapped to attention by a new perspective or concept I hadn't considered, or in a way I hadn't considered, is exhilarating and quite honestly why I read. I think it was James Baldwin who said all art is a kind of confession, and many of these books were heart-pounding in their dedication to creative exploration and honesty, which does mean that most are quite divisive and not actually easily recommendable due to their specificity. Of the 50-ish books I read, my top 10-ish will be in no particular order until I get to the final book or books, where I will be giving out my coveted, the highly desired and sought after Fontaine's Author of the Year award, which is the author I read the most work of and who was most influential to my reading year. So it's the event of the season. Forget the Oscars, forget the Grammys. This is it. Also, sorry if my voice is a little bit hoarse. I did karaoke last night and went a little bit hard. 365 party girl, YOLO, we are young, you know how it goes. We're all gonna die. Let's get into it. The first book is one I've been itching to discuss and haven't because I literally finished it on December 31st in the nick of time. It's Glorious Exploits by Fergia Lennon. Gellin and Lampo are unemployed potters in Syracuse, ancient Sicily. The Peloponnesian War rages, but in a surprising turn of events, the Athenian offense has failed to invade Syracuse, and our boys have scored a sweet gig as guards of the Quarry, the makeshift prison for the sudden influx of thousands of captured Athenian soldiers. But even the Syracusans must admit that their enemy creates art like no other, and so the prisoners trade poetry for rations. Through this exchange, news of a new, never seen outside of Greece, Euripides play reaches the Homer-mad Lampo and Gellon. And so in a city ravaged by the Greeks, where the populace is grief-stricken and traumatized, a play written in response to a particularly brutal Athenian sacking, the Siege of Melos, I'm pretty sure, is staged for the first time by those very Athenians, starved and beaten to within an inch of their lives. The play is The Women of Troy. There are so many moving parts to this that could be the story's downfall. It's a mismatched buddy comedy with a large supporting cast. It's written in modern Irish vernacular and narrated by the very goofy Lampo. But in a very Greek and very Irish way, Lennon understands how thin the line between tragedy and comedy is. This is about how art can not only transcend but be the antidote to propaganda. I find stories on the power of stories to rarely shine. There's often a triteness and indulgence that becomes flattening, but this novel simply feels too clever to fall into any cliche. Delivered with warmth and wit that balances out the inevitable darkness, it's Euripidean and Homeric, sure, but also decidedly Lennon. Like the post-colonial context Dublin lends to Syracuse is a stroke of genius. It's just so good. Also, Lampo buys crocodile skin boots at the market and then for the rest of the novel refers to them as his Crocs. A surprising, moving, delightful read. Good Morning Midnight by Jean Rhys. I have a mental block when it comes to saying this author's name. As you may have noticed, I've mentioned this quite a few times on this channel because it was an absolute standout of the year. 1930s Paris, Europe is on the precipice of something, as is our narrator Sasha, a woman abandoned. She wanders the streets, half drunk, unwelcome, displaced in the world, caught in a spiral of self-destruction, completely hollowed out by her life spent dedicated to men. Reframed reframing and retelling is Jean Rhys's bread and butter, and this subverts that 20th century flaneur, the masculine hero's European cavorting, instead looking at the woman he has left behind. Observational stream of consciousness pages mingle with dips into memory as our narrator visits old haunts and we piece together what has caused her to fracture. For being written in 1939, this novel feels remarkably modern, not only in the exploration of patriarchy and sexuality, but in the humorous tone. Sasha's commentary is witty and insightful. The absurdity of her life is crystal clear. For a fairly cynical novel of despair, it was refreshingly void of self-pity and condescension. It's one I continue to think about and recommend. Children of Paradise by Camilla Grudova is not a novel to expect sense from. A linear plot and grounded lessons, the cinema with its ever-dark rooms and layers of grime and history is not the place for this kind of clarity. What this does explore is the intense, fleeting intimacy that art institutions, dwindling by the day, deal in, and the often overwhelming nature of this work. A girl in a foreign city begins working in a dilapidated, once grand cinema with a cult following and an equally cultish roster of staff. After lying about her cinema knowledge in the interview, she is immediately hired and enveloped into the grueling life of an usher, cleaning shit, piss, popcorn, drugs, semen, lollies and jewels and other debris from between seat cushions and aisles, dealing with the perverted and the senile. She passes the strange initiation tests and is accepted into the fold of her fellow ushers. So begin the afterwork screenings, the pooling of found treasure, drug roulettes and clandestine hookups. Central to the group, to the novel, is the sharing of film. This is a referential work, though I didn't find this to hinder my reading experience. Although I didn't understand all of the references, it's clear the author and Usher herself has a deep passion for film. Labeling the part cinema plays in this novel as pretentious feels disingenuous, at best tacky. I've worked high-end hospitality, serving the entitled and giddy, devouring leftovers and stale bottles of red wine after each shift, stumbling home to vomit in the shower from combining too many dregs, smelling like dairy and sweat whilst spilling champagne that costs more than my wages. The delirium that takes hold when shifts seem to repeat, the same complaints or inappropriate comments as if we are all performing in a play, is truly an experience of an alternate reality. I've worked longest, however, as a bookseller, the surrounding of pages eliciting a confessional attitude from customers who will divulge traumatic anecdotes over the latest Wilbur Smith or ask for the perfect recommendation for their terminally ill family member, proselytizing on the cancer-curing nature of celery juice, bulk buying political text to ship to countries that have banned them, that woman who needs to sniff every book before she buys it as she's allergic to certain ink. I've learnt intimate details from books ordered and ordered books according to intimate details. There's something about working in a place regarded as erudite where oddballs feel safe and artists and revolutionaries once flocked and were fostered, reduced to corporate retail. That is so discordant. I adored this grotesque, sticky ode to the disappearance of spaces for art-obsessed freaks and creeps. Independent bookstores and cinemas have such a huge place in my life and in my heart, and the magnitude of that loss means that despite the quite detached narratorial style and teeterings into the absurd, this packed an emotional punch for me. It was just such a novel. This is a novel. I adored it. Of course, Open Throat by Henry Hoke, concrete jungle where nightmares are made of. A stream of consciousness novella, all told from the perspective of a mountain lion who has taken refuge in the Hollywood Hills. The creature spends his time observing hikers and deviants, absorbing language and culture, and despite the aching hunger, doing his very best not to kill anyone. It's actually based on the very real P-22 cougar who was a celebrity in LA, sadly was euthanized in 2022. And this book may be tiny but has so much heart. The loneliness, the yearning for a home in a hostile world that sees you as a predator, the humanity in the animal and vice versa. I love this gay little mountain lion more than words can express. I loved every second of this experimental fever dream of a story. I spoke about it in my novella recommendation video, but if you're a fan of Max Porter, you'll probably appreciate this. If you don't like Max Porter's writing, I don't think you will. He ate. Rifqa by Mohammed El-Kurd is a poetry collection named after the poet's grandmother, Rifqa El-Kurd, an icon of Palestinian resistance who grew to be older than the state of Israel itself. She was a girl during the Nakba of 1948 and an elderly woman in the recent continued genocidal atrocities. The poet's family home in occupied East Jerusalem was literally annexed, so they shared a wall with their Israeli colonizers, and this collection really affected my understanding of the way violent occupation and dispossession alters time and space in a very metaphysical way, how to navigate reality when events that occurred decades ago still occur yesterday and tomorrow, with invisible borders being erected and beds filled with rubble. Through these poems, El-Kurd explores life under occupation, the culpability of American organizations, and what it means to be and continue to be survivors of ongoing ethnic cleansing. But of course, life, even under occupation, is full of, well, life, and I found the portrait painted of community, specifically the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, of family and humor, of individual Palestinians, to be what stuck with me most. I think there is risk of dipping into a sort of Orientalist infantilization when reading statistics and seeing horrific images and employing language often associated with historic events that carry an element of insurmountability. But this collection is so alive, it's so living and breathing right here, right now. What is occurring on every level, every scale is purposeful and deliberate action, choices that are the furthest thing from predestined. El-Kurd doesn't leave room for pity. He looks us straight in the eye as he introduces us to martyrs and artists, to family and friends, and makes sure we will not forget. Every single one of these poems affected me, and that's not something I find often with collections. And now I don't consider myself particularly skilled or confident in criticism of poetry, but the metaphor and allegory is so creative and thrilling, and there's an element of surprise on every page that had me glued to this. Of course, an extremely important collection for now, and we can only hope and fight for a free Palestine within our lifetime. Yeah, just wow. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I feel sometimes with classics, particularly Gothic or Gothic-esque fiction, it's kind of assumed that everybody knows what they are about. The themes sort of precede the plot or characters, and maybe that deters some people because, okay, it's about self-determination of the destitute and Victorian era fears of confinement and spiritual corruption, but like, what happens? So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what does happen because it's juicy. So our little Jane is orphaned and entrusted to her uncle, who then on his deathbed makes his wife promise to care for her. But alas, Jane grows up enduring horrific abuse at the hands of her male cousin, which comes to a head when she finally fights back, and as punishment is confined in a room of red velvet where she has a terror-induced mental break. This is within the first few pages, right? Immediately, Bronte begins blurring the lines between paranormal and reality as Jane has these visions, which become quite important later on. She is then sent to Lowood Institute, where she is actually excited to get an education. She loves books, but this place is less of a school and more of a workhouse. Two of the Bronte sisters actually died in similar institutes due to neglect, so this is a particularly harrowing, charged part of the novel. Sickness takes over the school due to negligence, but Jane remains well and is left to her own devices. Free to roam the forests, she comes into herself, and this section is so full of fairy imagery, it's magical. It also contains the iconic homoerotic best friendship with the kind Helen Burns. I love you, Helen Burns. Most famous parts of the novel take place at Thornfield Hall, where Jane finds herself as the governess of the ward of an enigmatic Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester, if you don't get your grubby mitts off of Jane. He's old and exhibits a loser-ish behavior, but sometimes had me giggling and kicking my feet, which is really a sign of personal weakness. Jane is doing kind of okay in this big old house until she begins to hear footsteps and ghoulish screams, and everyone convinces her that's just our weird servant Grace. It's all cool, but of course, it spirals from there. This novel is a feat for many reasons. Published under a male pseudonym and with the byline and autobiography, it really pushes at the power of self-determination and expression, as Jane, a smart, incredibly strong woman of faith, finds herself suffering at the hands of these patriarchs time and time again, simply due to her position as a poor woman and the circumstances of her birth. It also brings into question the fate of non-English women who aren't afforded the protection of colonial virtue, the protection protection of whiteness. Despite being religiously heavy, although in quite an interesting way that I think centers faith, Bronte was accused of anti-Christian behavior, which is how you know this is going to be good. Jane Eyre is not only thought-provoking and literarily, don't know if that's a word, monumental, but it is entertaining and so goddamn relatable. And this book contains one of my favorite quotes in all of literature: "I am no bird and no net ensnares me." It actually makes me emotional whenever I read that. Me when I am no bird and no net ensnares me. So if you've been putting off reading this, put it off no longer. You won't regret it. Brat by Gabriel Smith is a metafiction debut from London writer Gabriel Smith about a writer named Gabriel in London who is coming apart at the seams after the death of his father, and I flew through this. As Gabriel sorts through his parents' house, he discovers pieces of their lives that seem to contradict his knowing of them. There's a manuscript that seems to point to a secret family but changes every time he reads it. Then a script about an inconsistent sitcom episode that changes with every watch, all the while he is shedding. Pieces of his skin are quite literally falling off him in sheets. Why do people die? And when people die, does everything we know about them become memory and not fact? How then can we be sure we ever really knew them? What about all the people they were to everyone and all the possibilities of who they could have been? Do they also die? Does every version of a person die with them? Writing as creating parallel universes, alternate timelines, self-contained lives. Is writing inherently a warping of reality? Can a human's artistic creation be a kind of consciousness? Probs not. I don't know what I just said, but there is a need, an urgency, a curiosity to this novel that I found so incredibly refreshing and exciting. This, along with I Saw the TV Glow, really made me stop and consider the fourth dimension in 2024. In 2025, I hope to consider the fifth. Best of all, this was funny. The unconventional style, the stories within stories will definitely not be for everyone, but if you enjoy the experimental, if you're a language wrangler and sometimes feel as though identity is a costume, this may be for you. The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice is better than the first novel in the series, Interview with the Vampire. Why are you booing? I'm right. This novel is the Vampire Lestat's reclamation of his story, which was told, how honestly is debatable, to the entire world by Louis in Interview with the Vampire. Lestat is here to set the record straight, or in this case, gay. And so Lestat recounts to us his life story, born the son of a marquis in 18th century France. Although born into aristocracy, he is raised in squalor in a dilapidated chateau. The family are rich in title and land, but have no money, particularly not for their spare, purposeless, sensitive son Lestat, who wants nothing more than to be seen, who dreams of the stage. The opening of this novel is one of the most powerful character introductions I've ever read. The young Lestat enters the forest with nothing but his horse and dogs, determined to kill the wolves that have been terrorizing the village, and the brutal and violent result is bloody snow and the title of wolf killer, also a Gorgina fur coat and boots. So now Lestat has the confidence and style. What else is there to do but seduce the bourgeoisie merchant's violinist son and run away to chase their dreams in Paris together? There is such a lightness to Lestat. It is easy to see why Anne Rice was so enamored, because same, at his core, he is a lover of the art that cannot exist without humanity, and the humanity that cannot exist without art. He is a brilliant vampire because his thirst for life is unquenchable. This novel weaves through time and history, the first vampires, the cultish covens that worship Satan, and the Roman Marius turned in a druid ritual. Of course, we also hang out with Armand. It was so funny to read about him from a different perspective. Louis' descriptions of him as like this shining cuirass, magnetic and moonlit and copperhead, and then Lestat is like, this little ginger twink won't stop biting my ankles. He does not want that cookie. Well, at least not right now. I find Armand to be such a genuinely hilarious and tragic character. I'm always delighted by his strange gargoyle antics, and he really does have iPad kid energy. I'm so impressed the show picked up on that. It was a stroke of genius. If you haven't seen AMC's Interview with the Vampire, I'm mentioning it yet again. Hey, it's me again, telling you to watch that show. I do have to say the attention to detail paid to West versus East history is noticeable and quite irritating. There's a very interesting analysis of European paganism, how thin the veil between civilization and the mystical is. But then we scoot over a few countries and it's literally that tweet that was like, Anne Rice writing non-white characters. He walked orientally across the room in an Eastern way. It's pretty gross, and she goes further into Africa in later books, so I fear this will only be the beginning. Oh, also Lestat is telling us all of this history whilst preparing for a concert because it's the 1980s and he was risen from his hibernation by rock music. I'm not even kidding, he's a world famous rock star, leather pants and all. It's camp, it's crazy, it's tender. It's Lestat as a boy being pulled from the monastery he so loved, as a teenager abandoned by the theatre troupe he thought his new family on the orders of his tyrant father, pulled by Magnus from the warmth of his adoring Parisian audience. Despite it all, or perhaps in spite of it all, Lestat will be heard, he will be seen. He will not shrink when struck at, and Lestat is a queer icon in a very real, deep way. He embodies what so many have found beaten out of them. He is so fully himself, without apology, without shame. The murdering monster who is filled with light. He's not perfect, but he's pooky. He's so pooky. There's this one point in this hugely monumental reunion scene. The love of Lestat's immortal life is agreeing to journey with him. And Lestat interjects being like, okay, but you're not wearing those pants. I think I need to make a Vampire Chronicles like read along or discussion, because I'm sorry, that was very specific and also long, even though it wasn't even all my thoughts. I have just started Queen of the Damned, and it doesn't sit right with me, but it's not a surprise that the way Anne Rice is regarded in pop culture is as this like frivolous like vampire trend writer, when I honestly think these are American Gothic masterpieces. Sorry. The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson is not the kind of horror writer that makes me fear the dark. Rather, I'm left uneasy by all that she exposes in the light. The title story, The Lottery, follows villagers preparing for a ritual and is her most famous short story. For good reason, but a number of others in this collection blew me away. I rarely enjoy every story in a collection, but this was so strong overall. I definitely think I enjoyed it more than her other collection, Dark Tales, which erred more on the paranormal side, if I remember correctly, whereas this tackled certain social issues I hadn't seen her explore. My highlights were My Life with William R.H. Macy, which chronicles a girl's first day at a department store, a labyrinthine building where products, floors, customers, employees are meticulously numbered. It's darkly comedic and absurdly average, and as a retail worker, it really got me. In Charles, parents are regaled of the terrible exploits of their darling son's fellow kindergartner, Charles, and they grow fixated on finding out where this boy has come from. Flower Garden felt thematically more mature than some of the others. A beautiful young widow with a beautiful sickly child moves into the neighborhood and plans to establish a beautiful flower garden. But adoration of her begins to waver when she employs Mr. Jones, a black man, to assist her. And through the eyes of Mrs. Winning, the wealthy woman on the hill, Jackson exposes the violence in passivity. My favorite, though, is perhaps The Tooth. Clara must venture on her lonesome by bus and train to New York City to have a bothersome tooth extracted. Oscillating between pain and numbness, conscious and unconscious realms, the trip becomes increasingly precarious until this man appears in a blue suit, guiding her to safety at every turn. The embodiment of pain, the Sandman, I don't know, I'm obsessed with the dreamy dentistry imagery and loose prose. Tooth Fairy, more like Tooth Jim. Also very reminiscent of that Broad City episode where Abby gets her tooth out and then goes to Whole Foods or something, or Trader Joe's. I actually only read Shirley Jackson for the first time last year, but I feel like in a very spooky Shirley Jackson way, she has influenced me for a very long time. Every creative writing class I've taken, tutors have asked if I'm a fan of hers. Favorite authors and books have mentioned her, and customers consistently recommended her work to me, and everyone was right. There is something so validating in her work for me, in the way she recognizes the horror in the mundane. Not to overshare, but I struggle a lot with certain thought patterns and paranoias, and Shirley just freaking gets it. And it's such a comfort to read. Shirley Jacksonians, can I get a W in the chat? Can I get a drum roll, please? Because the time has come for the second annual Fontaine Award of Author of the Year. Who was the writer that swallowed my attention for months, that I read the most work of, that I became fixated on? It was none other than J.D. Salinger. I am a Salinger head and I can deny it no longer. It was quite tight for a second there. I really thought Bret Easton Ellis might take it. Oh, don't tell me if that changes your good opinion of me. Although interestingly, they are quite similar in a lot of ways. A recluse and a weirdo, J.D. Salinger published very few works in his lifetime, and I have now read all of them, which almost entirely follow the fictional family of the Glasses. Born to eccentric New Yorkers, former vaudeville performers, the Glass children were introduced to America as whiz kids on the radio program It's a Wise Child. Generations of Glass siblings dominated the airwaves from the 1920s to the 50s and toured the world. Salinger chronicles them at various stages of life, from precocious children to scholars, actors, soldiers, a monk, and the eldest brother, Seymour, the only true poet of the family. Seymour is really the beating heart of the Glass family and of Salinger's work. Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters. It follows the day of Seymour's wedding as Buddy, the second eldest, recently discharged from military hospital and the only Glass attending, attempts to make it to the ceremony with a ragtag group who do not know he is brother of the groom. On a hot, sticky day in New York in a car with strangers who hurl insults and assumptions at his family, Buddy's displacement feels claustrophobic, his disconnection from his family unnerving, particularly if you know what follows this story in the second half of this. Seymour, an introduction, is then Buddy's attempt to introduce Seymour to us, the dear reader, after he commits suicide on his honeymoon. This contrasts the first part, which has situational comedy and colourful characters to lean on. Here, Buddy is unfocused and autocratic, going on tangents that, whilst entertaining, can be quite trying. But what else is a brother to do with all his grief? He skirts around describing Seymour directly, instead addressing his students, Kafka, parentheses. When he does share anecdotes and descriptions, he immediately needs a break. And these flashes of Seymour, a love and brightness and a wisdom and purity he had that enamored all. Moments and memories are pristine and just so sad. Buddy never tries to explain or pathologize his brother's suicide, but we get it. This whole Glass world is constructed by Buddy, the writer and narrator of the family. Even The Catcher in the Rye is implied to have been written by him, and the result is extremely fragile and elusive as this meta-exploration of authorial power, because events are obviously refracted through Buddy's not entirely trustworthy and grief-fueled novelist perspective. We witness the moments leading up to Seymour's death, as well as the Glass's childhood in the short story collection For Esme with Love and Squalor, and the way it affects the younger siblings, Franny and Zoe and Franny and Zoe. How can a family whose value has hinged on contribution, articulation, and knowledge cope with sheer feeling? This is what much of Salinger's work explores, alienated sons and daughters all searching in Eastern and Western religions, in philosophies and cultures, in the written word and the stage for peace. And I love them in all of their pretentious, deeply flawed glory. This was particularly interesting to read in the age of family vloggers. How does your childhood becoming a sort of cultural, intellectual property affect your ability to assimilate and socialize and cope? There is this underlying feeling of exploitation, of children being preyed upon, used up and spat into society, expected to just adjust. Salinger himself was known to correspond with fans who were freshly 18-year-old girls. His history of alleged grooming and abuse is documented, and I'm not a we must separate the art from the artist person at the best of times. I'm completing a degree in English literature. That's just kind of a ridiculous notion. Particularly bizarre, I would say, in the case of Salinger, because the writing is very meta and Buddy so closely resembles Salinger. And the question of can writing ever be entirely truthful is heavily explored, and I actually think it adds a lot of context to his work in a way that can only really deepen your critical reading. I read an article that said that Salinger may have left hundreds of finished works with clear instructions on when and where to publish them to his descendants, and the thought that there are like filing cabinets full of pieces of this Glass family, this family that is so dear to me, of their lives. If anyone has a longitude and latitude, I may have a business proposition for you. That proposition may be a heist. So, Salinger's writing is like a woodblock print. You have to peel and carve away a lot of what can sometimes feel like bullshit, but that is just as important to the process for that eventual revelation. And what I am left with is quite simple in the most profound of ways. If you're looking to get into Salinger, my suggested reading order is The Catcher in the Rye, Franny and Zoe, For Esme with Love and Squalor, which I think is also called 9 Stories in some places, Raise High, The Roof Beam, Carpenters, and Seymour in Introduction. And then there are a bunch of random short stories from his student days and just on various platforms you can find online. I've talked about the Glass family a lot, of course, because they are my family now, but not all of his work explicitly follows the Glass family. A lot tackle, you know, post-war issues, the rise of teenagehood, yeah, disenfranchised youth. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. I think that concludes this video. These are the best books of 2024. Full stop, period. Everyone else is wrong and I'm right. This is objectively, these are the best books of 2024. So, in all seriousness, thank you for sticking around. Thank you for watching this video. If you made it through, watching my other videos, all of your awesome, insightful, kind, wise comments left on my other videos, all of the lovely people I get chatting to on Instagram. I really do this and make these videos because me buy book, me like book, me read book, me want to talk about book, and the point where I don't feel passionate about it or I get a single hate comment, I'll probably stop posting. Joking. Not about the hate comment, about the passion part. Because if I'm making money, I will continue to post. My ultimate dream is actually to land a sponsorship where I get to promote gambling to children. If anyone has connects in that regard, hit me up. But, okay, honestly, I'm thankful. Thank you. I hope you had a happy new year. I hope you have a happy year. I guess we can only see what 2025 has in store. Will my cat miraculously break all the bones in his leg again? Will I move to France? Will Cassandra Clare release a Shadowhunters novel? Only time will tell. But until then, I hope to see you sooner rather than later. And yeah. Okay. Love you. Bye.